I was
Um,
researching you, and I saw you hadn't done too many podcasts before. It seemed to be, I don't
um,
know, or was I just not
um,
looking in the right place?
I've, I've, I've done a few. I get quite a few requests for them, and well, I don't know.
Well, they have to write you a song. I mean, now it's a competition here for future requests. I'm setting the bar. Yeah.
Making it tough on them. Yeah, I mean, I do them from time to time. I'm not as a, you interviewed Steve, and he's Steve is a force of nature, So I'm
But
I he was my advisor, and there's this kind of moment as a long time ago, but there's this kind of moment when you are somebody's student, and maybe one day you do something like really smart, and you think, ah, the student will surpass the master, but but you don't hold that thought very long with Steve. He's more. I don't know if I've ever met anyone as just. I mean, he's brilliant, and which people who love him would agree with, and people who don't love him, would get mad about hearing that. But he's also, I think, one of the qualities of Steve is that there's a few. I mean, he's incredibly enthusiastic, and he has like a nose for connections that other people don't see. But the other thing, and it's enormously, I think, valuable in a lot of areas of living, is he is almost completely impervious to people trying to dissuade him from doing things. So, like, we've written articles before that, the reviews came back and they were just like horrific, just, like, felt like you want to quit your job and go do something else. And, Steve reads the review, and he's like, well, I mean, I think we could fix this, and this, I think we could write that section, or we could do this analysis. And I'm like, Steve, did you read the same review as I read? They hated this paper. They hate us. They think we should like stop being scientists. But he persists. It's admirable.
well, I guess that's one of the qualities you must have if you're going to start something, a movement like he started, and with your help. I mean, I feel like I'm speaking, completing the set today with the actual royalty, having you on the show.
Well, goodness, that's always a funny. I mean, it's a funny piece. I mean, ACT was so the secret with the co-founder of ACT business is that ACT was really built by a community. Acceptance and commitment therapy was made by a community of people. I ended up on the first book. Partly the timing was good, and partly Kirk Strassel and I were the only people audacious enough to tell Steve that he would be foolish not to include us and help him write that book. I mean, he told both of us no the first time, and we asked him, and he was just like, nah,
That's a great
Then,
strategy to have. You'll be foolish not to work with me.
well, and I mean, Kirk was a senior guy and a
Mm.
very experienced researcher. I was a graduate student at the time. So it was
I'm with him.
kind of audacious, and he refused it. But then, I don't know, a year or so later, the book wasn't finished yet, and he got Kirk and I together, and he was like, "All right, I want you guys to help me write this book." And so,
Well, I've done ACT. I had Stephen. He was my second or third guest, and yeah, I think I started at the top. I didn't realize at the time what a giant he is. And I mean, it's great to speak to you guys while you're still alive. Yeah, because I
Well,
had I had Viktor Frankl and had one of his students was late, many generations later. So with you guys, I'm still in time.
mm, when I have a kind of an odd academic history. Like I dropped out of high school and, had a mm, kind of a misspent youth. And
Research.
and so I started back in college, or I started in college in when I was 30. And I went to a community college, which I don't know what the equivalent would be in the UK or if there is even an equivalent, but a community college is like a 2-year university. And, they do offer some technical degrees, but they also offer a pathway for somebody who's a high school dropout to find their way to university. And the psychology club that I joined there, we got to invite a guest speaker, and Frankel was still alive. And I tried to invite him, but he needed first class airfare plus first class airfare for his wife. And our budget wasn't quite up to it, but you
Oh,
never
so
know.
close. Yeah, yeah.
You asked, you know,
Oh, I didn't realize it was even that close. Yeah, because I
yeah,
mean his
he,
yeah, because he was writing about the Holocaust, obviously. So, but yeah, I didn't
he
realize
lived
the connect.
he lived quite a long life. Oh, well, the existentialists are central in my universe.
So, did you ever imagine from then that from community college to being a PhD and authoring a book and being so respected as a psychologist, yeah, that's just seemed like somebody had told you about that back then.
I would have laughed out loud. Um, at the time, my ambition was, because I had this horrific history of um, addiction and alcoholism, and I mean, it was a horror show. And I, got sober in 1985, and pretty quickly figured out that I probably would need some education because I didn't know how to do anything except felonies. And so, I went, hence the community college. And I think I had the idea that maybe, just maybe, I could be like a drug counselor or something like that. They had this like 2-year program, and you could be a drug counselor. And I thought I probably, I'd never finished anything that took that long. And I didn't think I probably could do that, but maybe I could do that. But the idea of like, even like a bachelor's degree or doctoral training, it wasn't in my universe of experience. I didn't grow up I grew up, I mean, neither of my parents graduated from high school. I don't know. I doubt, I don't think I knew any PhDs growing up. I suppose I knew people who went to college, like my teachers went to college to be teachers. And I suppose I knew that my dentist went to college, and I had a couple of friends whose, dads were like engineers or something, but it was not in my universe of thinking even. And especially, you know, considering my, you know, the 15 preceding, years did not make such things likely.
But looking back at it, I mean, addiction counselor, you wouldn't want to go to a sex therapist who was a virgin, would you?
Well, y- and at the time, I had this idea that only an addict could understand an addict. And that's a pretty common notion. And people carry that with a lot of different difficulties. I think that the longer I the further down the road I traveled, the less unique addiction seemed to me. On the surface, formally, it looks different, but functionally, it squeezes lives down into small little spaces in ways that are not unlike a lot of other things that people struggle with, some of which we call disorders, and really, frankly, some of which we call great success.
Because you've
Um,
also written about anorexia and bulimia, so you haven't suffered from those.
no, I have not. And some of those books were collaborations, that there were people who I cared about and who I could see that their heart was in the work. And it was in my capacity to help them,
Oh, I
move,
see. Yeah.
move the ball down the road. So the anorexia book was my third PhD, I think, Rhonda Merwin. And she's, astonishing and brilliant and you know, deeply knowledgeable about anorexia. And so, I have played rhythm guitar for her.
This is like a
Um,
like a musical collaboration.
you got to have a rhythm guitar player. So, like that's cool. If everybody has to play lead guitar, then that's a terrible sounding band. You can have a little spot of that here and there, but
A
you need
cappella
really,
bands, yeah, they've got a limited repertoire. I mean, the barbershop
yeah,
quartet.
yeah. So, I've done a number of things like that. And I've tried to avoid in my career the tendency to specialization, especially specialization around psychiatric labels, which I have very little fondness for. Well, there would quite a lot of contempt. And
Okay.
so
So
I didn't
going
want
back
to get, I'm sorry.
no, no, so going back to so the red line between all these things, because you said that, because just for anyone new to ACT, because I had Stephen on the show and I
Mhm.
wrote the song about it, and I still actually use that song sometimes just to stop the voice in my head. And yeah, I remember the first line. I can. Most of us live in a state of constant confusion as automatic thoughts cause circuitous delusions. We don't want these feelings, so choose distractions. It really helps me.
It's good to have touchstones in your life, things that help you remember, that help you kind of come to ground and
So that applies to any disorder. You're saying, essentially, the same. It's the same
yeah,
disease,
I
just a
mean,
different name.
I think that, can you sort people according to these categories? Yes. Are Is that sorting process useful? That's much more in question, I would say. And, I think the heart of human suffering, we're much more alike than we are different. Even when we don't look alike, we're much more alike than we are different. I was just looking at a study recently, and it was this giant aggregation of, all kinds of brain studies. You know what I mean? A lot of the brain science has gone on in this universe of human suffering has been to sort of find the broken part or the broken pattern or the miswired bit. And, the promise of that has been constant for decades. And, if you know, look at certain patterns of activation and you sort of find a distribution of those patterns, and some people are a little more and some people are a little less. And, you get some kind of distribution of, the likeliness of that patterning. And then you take a group of people who are like non-clinical controls and you run those same tests and you also find this distribution.
Mhm.
And, then what the science very often does is say, is the peak of that distribution, some measure of central tendency, like and the average, statistically different, the one than the other. And, the larger the numbers of uh, people that you have in the study, the smaller the differences that you can find. But, one figure in particular I was looking at, you could see like if this is like the normal distribution and this is like the distribution of people with major depression, what it looked like was, like this. And so the overwhelming majority of people in either one of those distributions, I mean, if you're in one of those distributions, you're much more likely to be in the area of overlap than
Mm.
you are to be in the area that is sort of unique. Uh,
So if
to,
you're saying that if you're obese, you're going to be depressed, and if you're depressed, you're more likely to.
well, that, no, just clear. Like if you show a certain pattern of, uh, like you are identifiable as depressed,
Mhm.
and we've identified this certain pattern of brain activation, using fMRI, or some sort of imaging study. Well, not everybody's going to be exactly the same. I mean, there's no test for depression or
Mm, mm.
any, as a matter of fact, there are no sensitive and specific biological markers for any major psychiatric disorder. I mean, you ever notice when you go, for psychiatric diagnosis, they don't give you a blood test or anything. It's because there
Yeah.
is not one.
No,
And
no,
then
yeah.
there's no brain test. I mean, so what you see is a distribution. So the pattern that you're finding in people who are depressed, some people have it, more so, and some people have it less so. And
Okay.
you'll also find that, pattern in non-clinical folks, some people more so, some people less so. The question is it like these are the depressed one and these are the non-depressed one? Well, it turns out no, actually the patterns that you see in depressed and non-depressed people overlap. And as a matter of fact, they overlap so much that you need pretty big numbers to even tell that they aren't identical distributions.
Mhm.
So, what this is to say is that we're more alike than we're different.
Okay.
We're way more alike than we're different. We're way more alike than it seems, than it appears.
So after all these years of studying all these different conditions, because acceptance commitment therapy is a, as I understand, a great series of exercises people can use to work with any problem. But what have you seen a sort of a red line? Is there a cause behind it that is consistent?
I mean, of course, that has been one of the big, things that has been chased in psychiatric disorders. And, one of the causes that they've looked for is brain causes, and we haven't found them.
No.
Things that commonly understood cause of depression is this sort of chemical imbalance theory, which is just false. I mean, someone needs to drive a stake through the heart of that thing and put it in the grave. Not that brains don't have anything to do with emotion and behavior, but depression, the idea that depression is caused by, too little serotonin, the kind of
Mm.
quart low theory or any tuned up version has not been found to be true. It's also so that you can look at things like ACEs. adverse childhood events. And, you know, it predicts certain kinds of psychological difficulties. You know, like if you start to get a count of the number of adverse childhood events people have, then you can guess that they might be a little more. But you'll also find people that have a bunch of those adverse childhood events who don't have those outcomes. I, if I had to make my bet, and no one's been able to, you know, generate any kind of definitive, like if this, you know, like if you're exposed to this virus, then you get this illness. No one's been able to do. And I would say that that is likely because human behavior, understood broadly, emotion, cognition, sense of vitality and purpose, that these are complexly determined, that there are complexly determined, that there are there's more than one way to get there. Some of them almost certainly have to do with some vulnerabilities that we carry. Some of those vulnerabilities may, in fact, be genetic, although they're as likely to be epigenetic, you know, in their, you know, how has the environment operated on genes? And, you know, that is going to be a long and complex bit of unpacking. I mean,
So I
it's
guess,
nice if you have nice, simple causes.
yeah. So I guess you come in after the damage is done, there's a problem, and then you have in your work, you're a mirror and you get people to reframe their reactions, their rigid ways of thinking. Is that am I saying that?
Well, I'm hesitant to. I'm not wild about the language of broken and damage, unless you're pointing to actual things that are broken and damaged. I mean, you know, that's kind of a big assumption that, you know, people have the psychological troubles that they have because they've got broken brains or they've got broken histories. And, you know, I mean, I'm not like a flat earther or anything. You know, if you say, I think Kelly's got a broken arm and you show me an x-ray and I can see the break, and I'm like, okay. You know, if you say Kelly's got a broken brain, you know, show me the broken part. But, you know, I just talked to you about those distributions.
Mm.
It, that it's just not that simple. I like to stay at the level of description, at the level of, you know, what, you know, I could see and feel and know, and the same with my clients. So, you know, when a client comes to me, they come to me with things broken in their lives. If their brain is broken, well, I don't know about that. And I don't know anything I could tell them scientifically about that. But very often there are things that are broken in their lives. And very often they have a sense that there's no way forward.
Mm.
Mm. And that, see, I assume that there's always a way forward.
Yeah, you see, you would make a great podcast
Uh,
because you really listen to. I've heard you when you talk about you got started to talk about mindfulness because you found yourself being distracted in therapy sessions. So you ask your patients to repeat things and to slow down and say it again. So that must really help to unpick what the words people are using and how they frame things to themselves
I,
and to other people.
yeah, I mean, you know, when I say behavior is complexly determined, it's very often the case with behavior that you can't really tell what it means by seeing what it looks like. And, you know, you could think of casual instances of that are all around us, you know. So, you know, you told your mom you were going to go do something and she says, well, you could do that.
Mm.
Well, just that little inflection in voice means that, she's not, it sounds like an option being presented, but it's not an option being presented. It's a set of evaluations that are being
Yeah.
presented. Well, if you get that, and that's true for our own behavior. So it's not like we walk around with awareness of the sources of the organization of our own behavior. We hurt, we hide, and very often we are not in a particularly good touch with what hurts and what we're hiding from. I remember telling a counselor of some sort who I saw back in, yes, it was probably about 5 or 6 years before I got sober in 85. And I remember telling this counselor that my grandfather told me this story. And the story was that if you could catch a honeybee in your hands like this and not let any light in, that it wouldn't sting you. Now, I have no idea if this is true or not, but this is the story anyway. And, but you see, the problem here is once you've got him trapped, is how do you get rid of him without letting light in? Right. And so I told this uh, therapist, I told him, I said, it's like I've had something trapped in here, but I've had it trapped in here like so long, I can't even remember what it is. And I just know that if I let any light, and I think that's not an uncommon thing, that people will come to a place where they just don't know. And having a sense of the landscapes of, love and longing and fear, it requires patience, requires attention, a certain devotion. If you're a person who is suffering, you have likely not encountered very many people who come to your suffering with, you know, it- you know, with that perspective. They're problem solving, sometimes too quick to problem solve. And like, I don't think that the sort of terra ignota of, human longing is the enemy. I think it's beautiful and complex and always ready to surprise you. People are not used to having their suffering encountered in that way. But that is how it is for me. And so I always, people tell me the overt examples of their suffering. And they're things that get your attention, like a panic attack or a broken, destroyed relationship or feeling like you're dead inside. And I take those things as, I take them seriously. I take them as vertical, but I don't take them as exhaustive. So I was just consulting a while back on a client someone was seeing who they're talking about that the person just felt dead, just dead, like they knew they should feel something, but they didn't, you know, and at some risk for, ending their lives. But see, I mean, a person's kind of halfway competent. It's not like complicated to figure out how to kill yourself. So does the person want to die? Yes. Do they merely want to die? No. Because if that was exhaustive of their experience, they wouldn't be there talking to you. If they're talking to you, then there's something else there, whether they can see it or not. And it's not like I can see it, but I can see the manifestation of it is they're in front of me, and you can know a thing even by its absence, like a form pressed into wet clay, And so sometimes people can't tell you what's missing, but they can begin to describe the hollow place. And, I'm willing to join people in that place because my assumption is if we go there and willingly, that we'll find that there are other things in that landscape that don't capture attention so readily, that might be lived for, that might answer that old Viktor Frankl question about, I think it was either Frankl or Yalom who said, if you want to know what people would live for, sometimes you can ask them what they'd die for. It's a good question.
Oh, that's a good one.
What would you die for? I can think of things I could think of things I'd die. A lot of times people who are thinking about dying, they have a tremendous sense of justice and injustice in the world. Well, that means they care about, there are things that they care about. So do they hurt? Yes. Do they hurt so bad that they think they can't go on? Yes. Are they at risk of not going on? Yes. Are they merely, that collection of problems? No, I would say no, never. I've never seen it. And I would always assume that there is more possible there.
You are not that collection of problems.
No, you are not a life support system for a collection of problems. Brian Stevenson, fascinating guy. You should interview him. He's a civil rights attorney. He spent a career working with people in prison, children in prison. There's a movie about him, Just Mercy, which is pretty fantastic. I was very near on the dais when he was making a public address at the University of Mississippi some years back. And at one moment, he's just regaling, there's this audience full of brand new, it was the fall convocation. So it was like the brand new incoming class to the university. And at one moment in there, he says, "You are more than your greatest mistake." And he says, "Even if you're a murderer, you are more than your greatest mistake." I mean, works with people who are in prison, and some of them are, some of them are wrongly convicted, but some of them are actually murders. And he means it, I'm sitting behind him. I'm like levitating practically, because see, I need to know this. This is something I need to know. And I love to put that in people's ears. Like, what if it is so that you are more than your greatest mistake? What might that be? I don't know. Sure would like to find out, though.
Because they do that a lot in Buddhism as well. They take away the parts that are you, are not you. This is not me. This is not me. I'm not my pain. I'm not my suffering. I'm not all these sankharas. These. I'm the watcher. I'm the awareness. I'm sitting. And
I'm familiar with that approach, that kind of meditation, the sort of releasing of the things that are not me. I and I know people who use those sort of methods, and that they are, have been useful. They're they have less appeal to me. I mean, they're I guess I guess I know that people take those things to practical places, but I guess I always I don't know, maybe I'm just, too practical, but you see, I mean, like, why do we do those kind of exercises where it's like noticing I'm not my emotions, I'm not my, I had this thought and then I had that thought. Well, if I'm my thoughts, how could I have this one and that one? So I'm not my thoughts, I'm not my emotion, I'm not my memories. I'm not. Why do we do that functionally with people? What is the benefit of that? And I would say the
The value,
benefit,
you talk a lot about the values. So
yes, what
how
is
am I adding value? Yeah, what's the benefit?
the benefit of it is it's disruptive, I think. Because if you decide like I am my despair
Disrupt.
and 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 you are so identified with your despair that there is no you outside of your despair, then if you do these kinds of exercises where people can kind of get a sense of, the multitudes, they can get a sense sometimes of the me that is not, any of these particular things. Steve wrote a great paper back in the early 80s, Making Sense of Spirituality, that was about that. And I know Steve's quite fond of that. I, 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 I mean, I understand the concept of it, but I wasn't, like I guess maybe it has in part to do with how I came to the work that I do. I mean, I came to the work that I do out of sort of a moral bankruptcy, like in my life and in the living of it, I had just wrecked things, and, and I needed, and if you're just that, someone who wrecks things, well, then it makes sense to like eliminate yourself from the world. But there were people there who saw in me things that I could not see in myself. And I don't even know that they could name them, but the possibility of. And so, that's my job. And so I think when I think about self, I think about it. I don't, I mean, I'm familiar with this kind of no thing, but probably the way that I more is more common for me to think about it. And in some ways it gets you to the same place
Hmm.
if you start to think about self as this sort of repertoire, sort of viewing in the world, and you think about that as a creative act, like an inevitably creative act. Well, you could begin to ask, what have I made, and what might I make? Now, there are the voices in your head that will tell you about the limitations of what you might make, what you might make of yourself. And if you take those as, the way to go, it'll take you dark places. It took me, to the heart of depression and addiction and psychiatric hospitalization.
So
It's good to,
on your way up, on your journey, did
mhm.
you did you take did you blame other people? Do you try to
um,
get your patients to take responsibility, or is that
I was never really, I blame myself mostly. Sometimes people blame other people. Mm, I mean, there are some lousy situations in the world. I've spent good bits of my life, there have been times I blamed other people, but however hard I blamed anybody else, I always was blaming myself about 100 times harder than that. I mean, but, do you want to like dedicate your life to that? Is the question. And what are the consequences of dedicating your life to, you know, it's why I carried a copy of Frankel's Man's Search for Meaning around in my pocket like a compass. Back in the mid '80s, I was just kind of like, okay, if Viktor Frankl can find meaning and purpose in a death camp, maybe Kelly could find meaning and purpose, in Spokane, Washington. You know, it was like, okay, like, what will that look like? I don't know. And here, it's good to have, you can't, to my way of thinking anyway, or in my experience and my experience with others, this is not something that is very well worked out by working it out here. You work it out here. And so you need to find people who, want to enter this conversation of possibility.
mm,
Like what might you create? What might you come, even with the most savage of ingredients, even with the most terrible things that have been done to you, or maybe that you've done to yourself. I mean, I think about my heroes, they aren't any of them who sort of grew up in this pristine world where a drop of rain never fell. And many of them had not only external things that crashed in on their lives, but also were themselves extraordinarily destructive, including self destructive. I mean, you look at the work that Marshall Linehan created, and you think about, you know, young Marcia in a locked psychiatric hospital. Do you suppose she thought she could create a body of work that could help people who are, just persistently written off? I mean, it wouldn't be apparent there, but I would say her history and her experience, those raw materials, you know, created something new. And so I guess, I look, I look, I read Frankl and I think, here's a death camp. You can't imagine a worse situation. And then what comes out of it is a psychology of purpose and meaning.
and is that
You
still
know,
your
that
is that still a fix all compass? If someone can find the meaning in their life, do you still try and help your patients? Do you think that is a magic
it,
bullet?
it is central in my work. If I had to say another quality that Steve Hayes has is that he Steve knows that he doesn't know everything. He knows that he's got some competencies, but doesn't have other competencies. He knows that he can only see what he can see from where he sits. And he's really, really good at seeing other people who are sitting other places and can see other things. And he recruits them, and that includes people like me. Steve did not just bring me to Reno, Nevada to carry water for him. He brought me there because he could see a spark of creative work. And probably, I would say, what got me invited into that first edition of the ACT book, if I had to say, I mean, I was working on lots of stuff in the lab, the basic relational frame theory, kind of geeky lab stuff, and immersing myself in the clinical work. But I took very seriously when I very first got to graduate school, like if a behavior analyst were to redo Viktor Frankl, like really take seriously what Frankl was talking about, what would that look like? And I generated the first values protocols. I mean, it came out of those first protocols came out of a comp that I proposed, I think, like my first spring in graduate school. Now, that seemed like a worthwhile task to Steve. I mean, you can think of ACT. One way to think about ACT is that on the one hand, you've got the mental trap, and you've got certain technologies in there that, might help spring the trap. But now you've got, okay, so the trap sprung, now what? Okay, so the trap sprung, what are we going to like sit on the mountain, navel gaze? No, it's going to be, what will we do with that life having been sprung from the trap? So, when I was working on those original protocols to engage in these kind of deep inquiries about if you could make something in your life, what would you make? We were working with really serious and severe addiction, people with addiction troubles, like who had like, I think in the initial project that we did, people had like an average of like 8 unsuccessful, treatments in their history, 6, 8, something like that. Anyway, they were like heroin addicts who were getting the gold standard treatment for heroin addiction and continuing to relapse to heroin, and had additional, addictions. And, and, I I looked at these people and I thought, the day that they stop using is the day that, you know, 40 years of doing that is going to like all show up in living color right in front of you. I treated someone who many years ago who had encountered their late teen child trying to use their injection equipment. So like they came home and their
Oh God.
late teen child was trying to inject themselves with drugs. And there was this huge blow up and they fought and and the kid eventually says, well, I'm just gonna, I'm fine. I'll just go do this somewhere else. And they ended up facilitating it. You know, well, who wants to wake up to that? Who wants to like make contact with like I had a hand in my own child's addiction, like a direct hand in my own child's addiction. And I knew at the time, and especially when they have a solution to that immediately, which is a shot of dope. You know, a shot of dope will take it all away, at least for a minute. At least for a minute, it all goes away. So, you know, how do you stay stopped in the face of that? And I knew that it would have to be something that was more important than that pain, that could, keep people in this life. So what is it that would make all this pain, would make you say yes, to all this pain? What possibility would make that pain worth it? I mean, so that's at the center of my work. And to my way of thinking, all the work in ACT, getting present, opening up, is in the service of this act of creation, of making meaning and purpose, living meaning and purpose. I mean, for me, for some people, that's, they have traditions that they can rely on for some of that. They have religious faith traditions they're connected to or like that. I'm more of a kind of Albert Camus kind of a guy myself. And so, I think, mm, I think I don't know anything about ultimate purposes, but I know that I can make meaning in my own life. And I assume that every human being in front of me that's got a heartbeat can also, no matter how unlikely the odds.
What
Like
about this guy with the son? What happened?
the ultimate outcome of that particular treatment was, I believe, quite mixed. And the sort of long-term ultimate, I don't know, because of course, when you're working in these populations, people disappear. I mean, they just
Yeah.
you lose contact with them. But I'm not playing for certitude.
Mm.
I'm playing for possibility. Like I'm in the game for what is possible, not what is likely, not what is certain. I mean, addiction will give you certitude.
Yeah.
And
Okay.
I mean,
The opposite.
yeah,
Yeah.
you know
You
exactly
accept
how.
uncertainty. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
there's a historian and science fiction writer who I love, who's written a series called uh, Terra Ignota, and it refers to, you're in Italy. And so if you look at like, old maps from like the, 14th and 15th century, they've got, these are the lands that have names and,
Mm.
the different names. And then there are the seas that have names. But then you get out towards the edge of the map, and you'll see these things like, it'll say, Terra Ignota, like unknown land. It'll say there dragons be there, or, things like that, And so that's where I want to travel with people, is into unknown lands. And, you will definitely see things on the map that say dragons. And the easiest thing is to turn back to what you already know and do what you've already done. And even if it's kind of lousy, it, it's known. But I always assume that even people trapped in the midst of, terrible repetition and patterning, that there's more that they want.
Yeah. Because they still have desires. So yeah.
Longings, both known and unknown.
Because with the Buddhism, they say you have to, give up desires, but maybe you have to just transmute them to a higher level into an altruistic way, into a selfless service for others.
Mm.
And then that can be your meaning.
You know, the the thing with longings and values that the risk is that people latch onto them in a way that is unworkable. So, if I say, what's of value to me, like being a good dad to my children, you can watch parents who get so like, I've got to be a good parent, and they'll, sort of latch onto, they'll have a story in their head about what that means and what their kids have to do and have to be sure not to do. And they'll exert such strong control that the minute their kids, figure out that you can't really control them, they just bust out, and you end up blowing up that thing. And so it's that attachment to, like this particular outcome or some known outcome. That seems to me to be the trouble. But when you approach something like, I want to be a good dad or I want to be a good partner to my partner, and you approach it as an ongoing, evolving, creative piece of creative work,
Creative.
then y- y- that seems less problematic. Even to the extent that you hit places where you don't know how to move forward. Well, that could be part of it. I mean, when you're writing music, do you just have like this steady flow of new musical ideas, and it just goes on and on and on? No. You know, I mean, you you persist, you sit, and sometimes you're dumbfounded.
Mm.
But if you're not willing to be dumbfounded, then you don't get to stay in the game.
Yeah.
You gotta be willing to not know. You got to keep your feet moving on the days when you're flat as a pancake. Try not to do things that'll create messes that you'll have to clean up later. I've got a meditation I used to offer, and it comes from early in my recovery. And it's about sitting on your hands, like when you don't have any idea what to do and you just feel like you're going to explode. Then, you just, you know, one under each cheek and just sit on your hands. And the reason for it is because there's not really that much damage you can do in the world if you're sitting on your hands. And I mean, there's just only so far you can kind of reach, and, only with your feet, and they're not as coordinated. And then maybe, and this, comes out of my own experience. I mean, there were days early in my recovery when I felt incredibly inspired and like something amazing and possible might happen. But there were lots and lots of days when I just thought, you are kidding yourself. You are irretrievably broken, and and always will be. And what I did on those days is I sat on my hands. Now at the time, I thought that those were wasted days. But sitting back, I don't think so. I think that there are a lot of days of sitting on my hands between then and now. And so, you know, what I try to practice and what I try to teach people to practice is to, put a handle on what is valuable to them and to move their lives in that direction. And on the days when that's like impossible, well, maybe it's a day for hand sitting, and maybe hand sitting is part of that. And, there'll be maybe less mess to clean up. I'll bet you there have been days when you felt like taking your guitars and just smashing them against the wall. But, then the next day, you had a bunch of broken guitars.
Yeah. But I really hear you with that. Yeah, get a compass and decide where you're going. And someone said to me that
Mhm.
a passenger jet is off course 90% of the time, but it still always gets to New York or Paris, wherever it's going. And so maybe if you just stop chasing those desires, the desire for change, this desire, because addiction is just banging the rabbit as it comes out of the holes, that game. And
There's no end to it.
there's no end to you can't satisfy desire with trying to satisfy. I mean, you can't if you pour fuel on a fire, it makes it worse. It makes more desire.
Well, and even the things that you value, I mean, I think it's worth being prepared. I mean, they're evolving things.
it's not an
I
end
mean,
goal, is it? I mean,
no, and it might actually take you somewhere where you see something remarkable that you couldn't have seen from where you were before.
yeah,
I mean, what we're doing right now, it's not like I could have seen that in 1985. I couldn't even imagine finishing a 2-year drug counseling degree. I mean, the idea that I'd be on the international lecture circuit or something like that. I mean, but it turns out that you don't have to know in advance.
mm,
But it seems a necessary bit is to practice this day, and you have to find your practice. You have to meet yourself where you are on that day and then ask, this day, as far as I understand it, this day, who
yeah.
do I want to be? And, for me, also involved being prepared to know that I will be extraordinarily wrong. If you don't get to be wrong, then you don't get to play. I spent about
Acceptance.
I spent about 10 years with that very, very devoted yoga practice, and I had a pose that was sort of my nemesis, and I would fall in it always. And my teacher told me one time, she said, "What if falling were part of the pose?" And I really took it on. Like, oh yeah, like what would that look like? And and I would say that that's true of every sort of serious practice. You have to learn to fall. You have to let falling be part of the pose. And the only ones who don't fall are the ones that don't practice. That's the only way to avoid falling.
I heard you couldn't even fall into child's pose when you started.
I'm gone. No, no, I was too physically inflexible. I mean, that's that whole like decade of me sort of chasing like what does it mean? What does self care look like, and what does it mean to care? I mean, it wasn't just like the pursuit of the particular elements of self care, like a to do list or something like that. Part of it is not really that interesting, but it was like the meaning of self care and the meaning of the lack of it. And, that's like a great example of something that I got wrong for an embarrassingly long period of time. Like, I mean, I really was neglectful of myself in ways that are, I mean, I like how I let myself get away with that. I just, I can't explain it. It's just like
Self depreciation.
it, it, when it was asked in a certain way and that, my recognition of that, it happened in practice with other people. And, I wasn't alone in that. When I talked about, when I started asking that question out loud in front of audiences, I started asking them, you know, when did it become okay to neglect Kelly? When did that become okay? When did it become okay to joke about it? Like when I get the urge to strong physical exercise, I lie down until it passes. Ha, 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 ha. I laughed at that, but I wasn't laughing alone. I mean, the whole room
It's
was
funny. Oh
laughing.
yeah, yeah.
It's funny. It's funny, right? But
Yeah.
but then now think about it like with respect to like a child or someone who you like love. It's not funny anymore. And it really, boy, it was just like, man, how did how did that happen? How did I get here? How did I not see that? And then I just practiced with like everyone who was like willing to listen, for the next, decade, and it became part of my life, you know.
Dennis Turkon, and he talks a lot about compassion therapy, and so
Mhm.
yeah, that's really, if you can't love yourself, you're not in a you got to make your own foundations before you can love other people, no, and help.
Well, I mean, I think I did a lot of good
Yeah.
before then.
Oh yeah.
I think I did a lot of good before then. And I guess when I think about that, I think I feel sad that I left myself out of that for so long. But I'm not dead yet, so I mean, I'm still, and it's a good thing when you find a blind spot like that because it reminds you, and maybe causes you to like think about, well, I wonder where those are now, you know, and, you know, does it put you, does sort of finding and practicing in those areas allow you to do new things? I think so. So it allows you to grow in a direction you didn't even, wasn't even in your, I mean, in some ways I had been taking care of myself for a long time. Like when I stopped putting drugs and alcohol in my body every day, that was pretty, that was a kindness to me and to a lot of other people. Although I really mostly had other people in mind when I did that.
Okay. Yeah.
It was,
Stop inflicting pain on yourself and
ex-
others. Yeah.
yes, yeah. And it was really more, I think it was more focused initially on, damage that I'd done, people that I'd hurt. But, people are complicated. On the one hand, I was engaging in the most self-centered possible activity like every day. But then like what troubled me was how much I was like hurting other people. Like both those things can happen at the same time in the same human heart.
Yeah.
See, that's why, like when somebody comes in, they say, here's the trouble, and they present the trouble and you see it and you say, wow, that's trouble. I was saying, I wonder what else is there. Like, like wherever you see big trouble, I assume there's big love, like the other side of that.
Because you
Exactly.
you wouldn't talk about things you didn't actually really care about underneath.
No, if you really didn't care,
You wouldn't.
you wouldn't care that you didn't care.
Right.
Like the person who wants to die because they don't care about anything. Well, if you really didn't care, you wouldn't care that you didn't care. You just like go on and do the next thing. But people care, and that can become obscured. Like who they might be, what they might, their longings can become obscure to them.
is that living for other people. I'm in a spiritual organization called the Etheria Society, and they give us one of these affirmations, which is I am the divine presence, and I'm creating perfection throughout my whole life. And I did that. I repeated that as I was going around the house all the time. And my girlfriend was interrupting me a lot of the time, telling me, pointing out many of the mistakes I'd done, like, leaving my underwear in the middle of the corridor, or, leaving turmeric stains on just little things, nothing. So, but I finally realized that she is the divine presence that's trying to create perfection. That I was, and also, my mother when I was growing up, and when I had with that affirmation, I realized that I need to listen, and there's really the answers are already being given to me.
Yeah. It's a lovely little kind of shift.
Yeah, yeah. Living for other people. If I listen to all the things also if she listened to the things that I tell her, because she doesn't listen to me either.
Human beings we're complicated.
Yeah.
I mean, that used to be, I think that used to be the enemy for me, but
Do you listen to everything do you take on advice all the time, or
oh, I'm terrible at negative feedback and just
so you can give it, but you can't take it?
ridiculously sensitive to criticism.
Oh my God, Kelly.
I don't count it as a virtue or anything. And I haven't given up on myself. I think, I think I'm not done. and so
it sounds like a cop out. This sounds like
no, I just mean like
I'm a work in progress. So.
yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, I hope that I get to live for a really long time. Like I really, really hope that I get
Just to
live
make
for a
up
long
for.
time. No, no, not like that. I mean, it's difficult for me to take seriously that I can like win my okayness by accomplishment. I mean, that thought occurs to me, but I mean, I'm pretty, it's sort of like, oh, good one. No, I don't mean that. I mean, because I find life marvelously interesting and surprising, like things keep happening that I could never have imagined. And I just want to see, what's going to happen next, you know, even like in, like on a on a personal scale, it's interesting to me because, I've been able to do things in my life personally that I could never have imagined. I've been able to be useful, helpful. I've been able to be a good father and a good provider. So personally, a good mentor, also bad at all of those things. I've been able to do that also. But even in the world, I think David Sloan Wilson's right. I think the future is going to be better than the past, like really a lot better, like wildly better. And I'd even be willing to point to data that suggest that that is true. If you look at things like child mortality, maternal mortality over any time scale, long time scale. I mean, if you had any time in the history of the world that you could just be sort of dropped onto the planet and have a chance of surviving to adulthood, even there is no time that is better than this time right now.
Yeah.
right, right at this moment, the likeliness that you're going to be born into hardship or not survive your first year of life has never been better.
Mm.
And, and, I mean, I don't like the current global political situation. There are lots of things I don't like about it
Mm.
and lots of hazards out there, but I don't kid myself. I mean, people always think that the time that they're in is like the worst time. They think that the generation just behind them is the worst generation. Like, oh, these
No wars. There's
millennials,
no.
blah, 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 blah. I mean, you can find people saying that like going back, thousands of years, Like I personally, like part of the reason that I think the future is going to be a lot better than the past is because I think that like my children are better people than I really do.
Oh, okay.
I mean, like I know where the bodies are buried, like I know that what I said and what I did and where I've been and the things that I allowed to happen around me that my children would never tolerate, that
Mm.
they would just, that they would find abhorrent, that, you know, racism, what we called intellectually disabled children when I was, growing up in the 1950s and 1960s. I mean, I mean,
Yeah.
I don't want to remember this, and it
Well,
wasn't
that's
just
the
like
mid. That.
somebody else, like, I wasn't the leader of the pack, but I don't feel sort of less culpable, I like went along,
Oh, it's a lot worse than that. Yeah. Yeah. I mean.
Oh my goodness. Well, and then I think about my kids and like the idea of like, say, discriminating against someone, because of, their sexual preference or their gender identity or their
Mm.
race or an intellectual. I mean, they wouldn't say it, they wouldn't do it, they wouldn't have it. I don't think they're perfect or anything,
No. No.
but I think if I got to grow up around people like them, I'd be better off
Yeah.
than I
Yeah.
was growing up around people that I grew up around because it was not nice, Like I was like not gender typical kid. Like I was way more interested in my mom's sewing machine than I was in, you know, going hunting with my dad. To be a boy in, 1965 who's interested in his mom's sewing machine. I mean, the people who loved me made fun of me. I mean, there were genuinely people who loved me who were like, "Oh, look, Nancy's playing with the sewing machine," kind of
Yeah.
humiliation of that. I mean, it was, nobody was like hiding it. It was just sort of like, "Oh, there we are." And I think, would my kids say something like that, to my grandson? The heavens no. I mean, not in a million years. And if you said it, they'd be like,
Yeah.
getting up in your face.
And that's in less than one generation or one generation.
A
That's.
single generation.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, sometimes it does go too far, but you need to have these cultural. You need to have to push the boundaries to. Otherwise, we wouldn't be changing. So.
Yeah. When I hear things about like the excesses of, acknowledging the horrors of racism that are systemic, I always like, I mean, I'm like, come on. Like all of a sudden we're going to worry about, like the day that equality starts to apply to someone else, then we're going to start worrying about, oh, are we going a little overboard here or not? Like, come on, 200 years of like going a little overboard in the opposite direction. If we overshoot the mark in places, I think we'll probably survive that,
Yeah. Yeah.
like,
It's the least of our worries.
and,
But I
and,
know it's even
and
my father, even older generations. It seeped into them that they've changed it because it just seeps down to the consciousness.
yes, yeah.
Yeah.
Are there excesses in those things? Probably, maybe. Do they need me to help them sort that out? Probably not. I'm just
It'll
trying to pay
correct you.
attention. I'm just trying to pay attention and, see if I can't make of myself someone who can, continue to be of support and use in this world, and, assume that they will sort this out in some way that works for them, and assume that there are things in there that they're seeing that I'm just not even seeing yet.
Yeah. Well, that gives you so much hope for the future of our race when you've seen these changes just
Yeah,
in
yeah,
your
absolutely.
time.
Yeah.
Imagine we're on the up. Positivity.
I I I think that it is there in our potential, and I'm betting on, human cooperation and
Listening to each other.
mm, mhm.
All right. Well, I'm fully inspired. So, Kelly, you've been. You want to play rhythm guitar?
Guitar is like one of those things. Like people ask me, "Do you play guitar?" And I say, "Well, that would be a generous description of what I do with a guitar." And they always think I'm like being falsely modest, and so they'll kind of turn to my wife and they'll say, "No, he can really play, Caddy," and she sort of looks at,
You're a work in progress, Kelly.
"Amen, amen."
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, thanks again so much for taking the time to chat, and I'll get to work on a song.
It was fun. It was fun talking with you, Jack.
All right, mate. You have a great day.
See you down the road.
See you down the road. Bye-bye.
If I did all the things that you tell me, and you did all the things that I tell you, there's nothing that we couldn't do. If I listen to you, and you listen to me, imagine how happy we'd be. 'Cause you tell me truths I don't like to hear. Truth is painful, you know you can lie sometimes. Then I'd listen more to the wise words you've said, like if I did all the things that you tell me, and you did all the things that I tell you, there's nothing that we couldn't do. If I listen to you, and you listen to me, imagine how happy we'd be. We'd be healthier, happier, fitter and wiser, richer and thinner and younger and more organized. The world would be a better place without war. It's a simple thing but so hard to do. With ego involved, it's a blinkered worldview. And if you saw yourself from outside, you'd say, why didn't you tell me? Cause of this stupid human race, our thoughts pollute the very air we breathe. But if we're going to be the ones to make the change, it's our thoughts we need to contain and switch our brains from broadcast to receive. And if I lived for you,